has now finally arrived.
From knockouts to tap-outs.
It's all over!
Inside the octagon and beyond.
Is this not real now? Are we pretending?
We're rich, baby. Break out the red panties.
This is the MMA Report with John Pollock.
Unbelievable! Here we go!
Hello and welcome to another edition of the MMA Report. I'm your host, John Pollock. Thank you for tuning into the show. Coming up, we are going to be joined by Jon Anik, the play-by-play announcer for the UFC. He is going to be calling UFC 208 this Saturday night alongside Joe Rogan and Daniel Cormier. Looking forward to having Jon Anik back on the show, and we've got quite the lineup of Johns on the show, and it's not the kind of Johns you're probably deferring to, rather mixed martial arts versions of Johns, because we'll be joined by Jon Anik, Fight Network analyst John Ramdeen, and of course me to guide you through all of this. We've got lots to discuss with both men who do play-by-play announcing. We're also going to be chatting with Ramdeen about a significant anniversary this week, in my opinion. So you can stay tuned for that. We're going to run through the news and also look ahead to UFC 208 on Saturday night from Brooklyn, New York at the Barclays Center. It's a card that has certainly had its criticism, mainly surrounding the creation of the UFC women's featherweight title. And it's a fight that I like a lot between Holly Holm and Germaine de Randamie. It's a very difficult fight to predict in terms of how it goes, but the bigger obstacle is going to be this featherweight division that you have now created. There are no other women part of this division. Neither participant in the main event on Saturday even seems 100% committed to staying at 145. We very well could see the winner of this fight just revert back to 135. It had always been stated that we can't do a 145 division because there just aren't enough stars. There's Chris Cyborg and everyone else. Well, now we're doing the division with everyone else. Granted, you're taking two bantamweights that are now coming up to 145. So we will discuss that card in detail, but some notes from the past week. And we'll start off with Bellator because there were a number of significant stories this past week. Maybe the most important in terms of just a bigger television landscape story, and probably isn't going to have all too much of an impact on Bellator, was the announcement earlier this week. It was first broken by The Hollywood Reporter that at some point early 2018, they're targeting Spike TV is going to be rebranding itself and becoming the Paramount Network. Now, it's important to note, Viacom has a financial stake in Bellator. They're committed to this. That is their programming on their network. It's not like they're just making this sweeping change and getting away from certain programming where Bellator is going to get axed. That's not likely to happen. So that's something to watch for next year. If you remember, you trace the history of Spike TV. It goes back to the Nashville network, which aired a lot of repeats of shows like Dallas that I was a big fan of, the Grand Ole Opry, very much tuned to that Nashville network theme. Then we became the National Network, which was in concert with the Viacom owners getting control of the World Wrestling Federation and their top television property in Monday Night Raw and giving it a more national appeal, hence the National Network, and then becoming Spike TV in 2003, their most successful version of the channel, where they made sweeping changes, introduced a lot of programming aimed at that 18 to 34 demographic. Some stuck, most did not. Look up Stripperella for examples of the latter. But again, very much built around the WWE as that Monday night juggernaut on cable. They also had their hand in a lot of different original programming. And then it was The Ultimate Fighter that got the green light, and in which the WWE actually had a stipulation in their television contract that they approved what could be that show to follow Raw on Monday night, that Raw would essentially serve as a lead-in for, and they gave the okay to Spike that, sure, we'll allow The Ultimate Fighter on, and it was the most successful show that Spike launched to capitalize off that WWE, WWF audience at the time. So The Ultimate Fighter was a gigantic success, and in no small part because of the giant lead-in they had of professional wrestling fans that got captivated by the personalities on The Ultimate Fighter, and the thing grew. Then Ultimate Fighter got its own night when they moved to Thursday, and then the WWE left Spike. Spike made it very public at the time that they were exiting negotiations with the WWE, and really hurt the WWE because this public announcement that they are removing themselves from the negotiating table left the WWE without a whole lot of leverage in the television world, and they were able to strike a deal with the USA Network and return to the USA Network where they had left in 2000. But it was under a deal where they were given a significant rights fee but would not share in the advertising. Ultimate Fighter was now its own franchise, and they were going to build things around the UFC, and that is what they did throughout the duration of the UFC's run on Spike. Tons of programming that helped identify Spike and find its audience. So Spike TV has a deep, deep history intertwined with mixed martial arts, and that continued when the UFC left, signed the Fox deal, and then the UFC programming still remained on Spike for another year because of the window they had. And then once the deal officially was done and Bellator was already in the Viacom pipeline, running on MTV2, if you remember, and then once that year expired, moved Bellator over to Spike, and thus you have had that relationship since, and with Viacom buying a stake in the promotion. So that will take place in about a year with the move to the Paramount Network, and I wouldn't foresee any major changes to Bellator, but we shall see. There's always things that can arise out of significant changes in a network and their direction. They also announced this week that Rory MacDonald and Paul Daley are going to fight May the 19th in London, England at Bellator 179. Earlier than we anticipated Rory MacDonald fighting. He had originally targeted the summer, but then he did an interview not too long ago where he was looking at fighting a little earlier than the summer. So that makes sense for May. I like this fight a lot. Paul Daley is coming off that incredible knockout over Brennan Ward, which they will replay over and over. And I like Rory coming in here. It's going to be close to a year since he fought Stephen Thompson last. And having a 3-round fight with Paul Daley, I think makes a whole lot of sense, and building towards the title fight. I don't know how crazy I am about a fighter entering, and not so much whether they deserve or don't deserve a title fight. You could completely justify putting Rory MacDonald against Douglas Lima now for the welterweight title. But I think it's important to, especially after a long layoff like Rory has had, to come in and introduce yourself to a new audience and to get acclimated to the Bellator way of fights and preparation and working out any issues that may have been lingering since the Stephen Thompson fight. And if he looks great against Paul Daley, then you can move forward to the Douglas Lima fight if he is still champion afterwards. But that is a great fight. It's going to be an incredible atmosphere in London, England. I know some people were hung up on the idea of Paul Daley and Michael Page, but this is a great fight with Rory MacDonald and Paul Daley. You know, there's the question if Michael Page would have been ready for a Paul Daley this early in his career. I know people want to see that step up in competition. Would Paul Daley be too much? And Bellator is very focused on building stars and not necessarily throwing them into the deep end. And you can compare that to this Saturday's card where you don't have a whole lot of contenders at light heavyweight, and Jared Cannonier, maybe he's never going to fight for the title. Maybe he's not going to amount to anything. But if you're looking at diamonds in the rough, he's one of them at 205 pounds, and he just beat Iwan Kudalaba in December, and now he gets Glover Teixeira. That's really tough to, I mean, if he wins, wow, you're really ahead of the game, and this guy is made at 205 pounds. But if not, you've kind of hurt a possible prospect in a division that sorely needs prospects. Also this week, it was made official, Stipe Miocic will fight Junior Dos Santos on May the 13th, headliner at UFC 211 in Dallas, Texas on May the 13th. Combate out of Brazil originally reported that fight, and they're also reporting that Ben Rothwell and Fabricio Verdum will likely be the co-feature on that card, which is somewhat of the pattern you're seeing in the UFC when you have big title fights and having contenders in that second fight from the top, where if there is an injury or a problem, you have two heavyweights that are training for that date that you could insert there, and you could very easily justify Fabricio Verdum in that title fight as well. But they are going with the rematch with Miocic and Junior Dos Santos, who fought in December of 2014, which was a war won by Junior Dos Santos that night. Some interesting contracts to watch in the UFC. We've seen this proliferation of fighters that the UFC is letting their contracts run out or right down to the wire. And we got some more fighters coming forward this past week noting their contract status. Tim Boetsch is going into the last fight on his deal this Saturday when he fights Ronaldo Jacare Souza. And Frankie Edgar has one fight remaining on his deal, he revealed on the MMA Hour with Ariel Helwani. Edgar's very confident they're going to come to an agreement and figure something out. He's in no desire to leave the UFC, but it is interesting how many fighters are having their contracts run up and how many will be retained. One that is not is Ryan Bader, who Dana White confirmed over the past week. They are not going to match the Bellator offer, and he expects Bader to go to Bellator. There is no official announcement yet from Bellator that they have signed the light heavyweight, but it seems just a matter of time before that announcement comes. Again, we look at that light heavyweight division. Think of this. If there had been an injury to Daniel Cormier or Anthony Johnson, and hopefully that doesn't happen for the Buffalo card in April, but if there was, Ryan Bader would have been that next guy to get that title fight, in my opinion, if you needed a replacement. With John Jones suspended and now Misha Cirkunov, he was taken off of the UFC rankings, and Mike Bond reporting he is not under contract at the moment, so he's another one to watch. I really hope the UFC is aggressive in retaining Misha Cirkunov and doesn't let him out of their sight, because he is another of those few prospects at light heavyweight to focus upon. And I think that Misha Cirkunov could have a huge year in 2017. Those are some of the news and notes from the past week. We'll take the time out. We're coming back. We're going to hear from John Ramdeen, Fight Network analyst and play-by-play commentator. We're going to be chatting about UFC 208 this weekend. And still to come, the voice of the UFC, Jon Anik, is also going to stop by. It's a packed edition of the MMA Report. Stay tuned.
Right now, it's Carano's fight to lose. Getsy goes for the takedown. She stood right up by Carano. A knee by Carano. And this fight will go to the judges as both fighters receive a great round of applause. They embrace each other. Tremendous moment, a tremendous fight for mixed martial arts, and they're receiving a standing ovation from the huge crowd in attendance at the DeSoto Civic Center. What a moment.
I think they have just broken some serious ground for women MMA.
Back on the MMA Report, John Pollock here with you and joined by Fight Network's own John Ramdeen.
Yeah.
How are you, sir?
What is going on?
We've got a card coming up this weekend, UFC 208.
Yeah.
When this was first announced, a lot of people were asking questions about the viability of this women's featherweight division. But as you look at this card, John, there's a lot of interesting fights on this show. What has your interest for Saturday night?
I think there's a couple of fights. You're interested when the UFC is crowning a new champion, because especially if you follow the sport of mixed martial arts, it's like, well, what's happening? Like, right, for years we thought that the UFC was going to, if they were going to introduce the 145-pound division, that Cyborg was going to be involved.
And the argument against it was, yeah, there's Cyborg, but there's no one else for her. Yeah. Well, now we're going to make a division minus Cyborg with everyone else. And granted, Holly Holm, certainly a star.
Yep.
And Jermaine Durand, to me, I think definitely has the chance to win this fight. I like the fight a lot.
I do too. But I think we're talking about it on the desk, that if this fight was just a fight night, the main event, if it was headlining a fight night card somewhere, 5 rounds, no title on the line, I don't think anybody would be complaining. But
I don't think this pay-per-view would do any more buys with or without this title.
I agree.
As we learned with Anthony Pettis and Max Holloway, that was a great card. Yep. Turned out to be excellent. Was the lowest purchased of the year. That to me was proof that just adding a title, people see through that. And it's, to me, you're either interested in the fight or you're not interested in the fight. The days of having a championship, at least at this level, I don't think that's changing anyone's mind that this is a title fight versus Holly Holm and Jermaine Durand to me.
I totally hear what you're saying, but at the same time, think about what happened, I think it was the following week, UFC 206, one of the lowest pay-per-view of the year. It took place right here in our backyard of Toronto. But look at the numbers the following week when they put it on free television.
That's a great point.
You know, the fact is that, you know, even though people, I guess, for some reason didn't feel that was a destination for them, once they heard what happened, it was a must-see event. And really, I think when you look objectively, UFC 206 is going to go down as one of the top 3 best cards of the entire year.
Yeah, I don't disagree at all. Now, with Holly Holm, it's interesting because she was part of that big UFC 196 card last year where it was Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor, and she lost the title that night to Miesha Tate. That was her first fight since the Ronda Rousey fight, so a lot of popularity coming out of that. Then her and Valentina Shevchenko, their fight on Fox peaked at 4.6 million viewers. Do you see... what's your expectation? Is this going to be a card? I'm looking at 230,000 buys. Do you think that we're kind of underestimating the drawing power of Holly Holm? Because we've seen on television, she's a massive draw. Can that translate to pay-per-view when you're not fighting someone that's all that recognizable to casual fans out there?
Well, I know a lot of people believe that the fame and the numbers and the eyeballs just transfer because they saw, well, Ronda Rousey was the star. And then Ronda Rousey gets kicked in the face and Holly Holm becomes the champion. Then they saw Holly Holm's numbers for the Miesha Tate fight. Granted, Conor McGregor was a part of that card, so the numbers kind of distorted. And then on top of that, they have Holly Holm versus Valentina Shevchenko. That did good numbers as well.
Very good numbers.
People saw Valentina Shevchenko beat Holly Holm, and they just assumed that Shevchenko would take Holly Holm's heat. Look at the numbers for Shevchenko and Pena.
That was a really low Fox number with Pena. It's very hard to see where people gravitate towards stars.
They gravitate towards stars. And Holly Holm is a star. She has the it factor. She's beautiful, and she was a champion, and she's articulate, and there's so many reasons to get behind Holly Holm, just like there were so many reasons to get behind Ronda Rousey or Conor McGregor or some of these big stars because they have something that not everybody has. I love Valentina Shevchenko. I think that she is a remarkable martial artist, an athlete, but there's something missing. There's some X factor that she doesn't have that I believe Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor and Brock Lesnar has.
There's a number of interesting fights on this card. The addition of Anderson Silva, you brought up this point, and I think it's a very valid one, is that I don't think many people are watching Anderson Silva thinking this is a guy that will get back and become middleweight champion. But there's a ton of interest to see this guy. And much like a BJ Penn, or you can go through many stars who they're past their prime, but they're still very viable. They're big stars.
Jalen Tito.
Let's put them in the right fights. And to me, Derek Brunson is a guy that is still improving, a very dangerous middleweight. And this is a weird fight to make because I don't think Anderson Silva, you brought up the idea of him fighting Vitor Belfort again. Yeah. That would be a gigantic fight, I feel.
Huge.
If that was happening on Saturday in Brooklyn, that would be the main event of this show, whether it was called it or not.
100%. Then you add to that Holly Holm, Dustin Poirier, Jim Miller, Jacare, and Tim Boetsch. This becomes a destination for fight fans. Now, again, as you pointed out, Derek Brunson's a legitimate talent. Where is he in the top 10? Is he a top 10? Maybe. What do the rankings really mean? Robert Whittaker, this guy's a ridiculous talent as well. But I think when we're objective, we look at a certain group of fighters, being champion Michael Bisping, and even Michael Bisping, people don't believe, it's kind of fluky and blah, blah, blah. He got in Luke's head. And there's so many excuses, and people are discounting the way that Michael Bisping won and why he's champion, because I think a lot of people believe that Luke Rockhold, Chris Weidman, Jacare, specifically Jacare and Yoel Romero, and then Gegard Mousasi, that pool is the guys at 185 pounds, and that Derek Brunson and Robert Whittaker and some of these other guys, they fall underneath. And then you have the legends like Anderson Silva and Vitor Belfort and Michael Bisping and Dan Henderson if he decides to come back. You have all these guys that helped pioneer the sport, and they were the stars. But what does that really mean? You're trying to gain attention. And Anderson Silva, one of the things about Anderson Silva is he had technology that not everybody else had at the time. And would you really be surprised? Because I think what people look at is they look at Anderson Silva of the last 3 or 4 years, or however, since he lost the title to Chris Weidman. That's kind of what we look at Anderson Silva. Would you be really surprised if Derek Brunson came charging at Anderson Silva and he sidestepped him and landed a right cross and a left hook and a kick to the head and sent Derek Brunson into unconsciousness? I don't think anybody would be surprised by that. But just like I don't think anybody would be surprised if Derek Brunson gets underneath, pins this guy up against the cage, and beats on him or lays on him for 15 minutes.
Yeah, do you feel Bellator is doing a better job of promoting, for lack of a better term, a Legends division? In the UFC, and I think this is very much a philosophical one, that your stars are there and we're looking at the next level of talent. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you can't do both. You can't be building young talent, your Yair Rodriguez, Kelvin Gastelum, who's got Vitor Belfort next, and still trying to maintain your legends, which Bellator very much wants to do.
I think that Coker's opinions, because he's the guy in charge of Bellator right now, the idea is to use the same model that he had with Strikeforce, is that you're trying to bring some of the biggest names, and if those names happen to be from the world of street fighting or the world of pro wrestling or from the UFC.
Or Herschel Walker. They didn't put him in there with a killer.
Exactly.
Because they wanted to get mileage out of Herschel Walker. Here's a star that might have some appeal beyond our core audience.
And that's what it comes down to. In addition to having some of these fun fights, these fights involving legends and, less experienced fighters from the NFL, they still also had Robbie Lawler as a champion. They had Luke Rockhold as a champion. They had Jacare as a champion. They had Cormier as a champion. They had Ronda Rousey as a champion. They had Nick Diaz as a champion. They've had so many legitimate fighters under the Strikeforce banner that Coker, I would imagine, is going to do the same thing with Strikeforce, with Bellator. You build the Michael Pages, you sign the Rory MacDonalds, you keep the Michael Chandlers of the world, and then you have all your relationships that you have with all the academies in California or now across the world. I think they just announced they're having a show in Hungary coming up,
yes.
Bellator. So Bellator looks like it's world domination. So they're going to try to pull from whatever local. When they go to Budapest, you have to imagine they're going to have a bunch of Hungarian fighters on the undercard, because that's what's going to sell in the local scene, the local market. You have a TV product, you put the big names on there, and then you fill the venue with the talent from whatever country or whatever city that you're in, and you build from there.
Later on in the show, we're going to be hearing from Jon Anik. He's going to be calling the card Saturday night with Joe Rogan and Daniel Cormier. And you're someone that has done three-man booths before.
Yeah.
What do you like or not like about the three-man booths? Because it's difficult with the navigation, and you'd know that better than me.
Luckily, my job is similar to Jon Anik's job, opposed to Cormier and Joe Rogan. And I feel that having the two color guys, they will kind of get caught with each other, because you have to be specific. When I do play-by-play now, I ask a question, Robin answers. Now I have to be specific. I have to ask Joe, or I have to ask Cormier specific questions, because if I just throw the answer, these guys now are battling for who's going to respond, and now they're going to have different opinions. But what I do like is that they're two different individuals. Daniel Cormier is the fighter. Joe Rogan has been around the block. He understands certain things. He knows players in the game. He probably sat in many meetings to get insight on some of these fighters. So I think that Cormier can bring the, I've been there, and Rogan brings the, I've talked to these guys, and in this environment, and based on this and this and this. So I think it can work. I'm just a big fan of the two people in the booth.
I think most are comfortable with that, and I mean, there's no shortage of great analysts that the UFC has to lean on as well. Now, do you want to feel old, John Ramdeen?
Oh God! So before you go there, I would imagine. I mean, I know that there's been talks that this could be Rogan's last run. So if this is the case, you need to groom somebody. Yeah. And why not have Cormier there? We know Brian Stan and Anik work, so why not try out some other people if that is the case? If Joe Rogan's had his fill and he wants to move on, you need somebody to fill his shoes, and you need somebody to get comfortable.
I am curious how many, hey, where is Mike Goldberg messages we see Saturday? Because there's people that they may just watch the pay-per-views. They're not consuming this daily. They They didn't. They watched 207 and heard Mike Goldberg. They didn't hear any farewell.
Yeah.
And now they're going to tune into the next pay-per-view, and he's gone.
Oh, he's sick. That's I'm sure they'll come up with. I don't think that people would think that he's booted from the UFC. I would think that, well, this doesn't make sense. Why is Mike Goldberg not here? Oh, he must have the day off. Family member's sick. He's on vacation. We'll wait to see for the next show. And then they'll realize, wait a second, is this guy now gone? Who is this new guy? So, but I mean, again, if you've followed the UFC, you've heard Anik on Fox. So,
very familiar voice.
Very familiar. So who knows? People might not even, make the connection.
Now, back to making you feel old,
God.
Okay?
I was trying to avoid this.
This week, February the 10th, marks the 10-year anniversary of the very first Elite XC card.
Wow.
Destiny, with Gina Carano and Julie Kedzie and Renzo Gracie against Frank Shamrock, which aired on the Fight Network in Canada in 2007. And, John, featured a three-man booth with Mauro Ranallo, now of the WWE.
Yeah.
Bill Goldberg, now of the WWE.
Was Quadros? Was
Jay Glazer.
Jay Glazer, that's right. Jay Glazer.
I felt so old because I remember that card so vividly.
Me too. I was so excited because, remember, I think there was the battle because Frank Shamrock had signed to Strikeforce.
He was set to do the Phil Baroni fight afterwards in June.
So there was the battle between Elite XC and Strikeforce, and it became...
And you and me, I remember always talking about, like, these two need to just figure out a way to work together because being separate... They're much stronger together than they are separate.
And that's what happened. They ended up working together. Was it that card that they worked together or no? Because, you're right. It was Elite XC. It was Baroni and Shamrock. Yes. I have that marquee in my basement, and it's a co-promoted event. So they found a way, and just that Renzo Gracie Shamrock fight. It was just...
disappointing because...
It was disappointing.
It ended with an illegal knee and... Frank stating he didn't know the rule, and
I thought I was here to fight.
Yeah,
I thought I was here to fight.
That was it. But it's obviously remembered for the Carano-Kedzie fight, which is really fascinating in history. That here, Gary Shaw really had to go to bat with the Showtime executives to get the fight, and they said, all right, you can do this fight, but if it doesn't work, we're probably not going in this direction. This was back when female fights, it was three-minute rounds.
I remember.
And how amazing is that here 10 years later, we're getting ready for a 5-round main event involving the women, headlining a UFC pay-per-view for 25 minutes.
That's awesome. So I used to run security for Hard Rock in Toronto, and lots of fight fans there. A lot of the security and door staff, they trained in martial arts. Some were fighters. So after we finished work one night, I had the Elite XC show. So I had seen it, but some of the other people hadn't seen it there.
And did they know what Elite XC was?
They just trusted what I said because I would say, just a lot of people were UFC guys, and then you turn them on to Pride, and it's like, oh, shit, this seems to be better than the UFC. And I'm like, well, there's lots of shit out there. So then Elite XC, so it's a lot, I would say probably a good 25 or 30 of us on the big screen. The place is shut down, Gina Carano and Julie Kedzie, and... nobody'd seen this before. I'd seen women's fighting, but for the most part, nobody in this room that was watching this had ever seen girls scrap it out. And the level of excitement that went on in this room and the cheering, and especially at the end where Gina and Julie hugged each other, and it showed that there was no animosity, that they were there to put on a show and they were professionals. It was just really, to me, a sign of things to come. And I knew that if the UFC eventually found I thought that Gina Carano would eventually make her way to the UFC. It felt like the UFC wanted to have her, but at that time she was such a big star. She had options that nobody else had at the time. Doing movies and the American Gladiator thing. So. It was something very, very new, and clearly, we look at some of the female fighters that paved the way. We look at Tara La Rosa, for example, Megumi Fuji, and of course Gina Carano. Because if they didn't have these athletes, Ronda Rousey wouldn't be able to make the millions and millions of dollars that she's made. So, yeah, man, what a cool part of history.
Yeah, Elite XC. All those shows are up on Fight Pass, and they're really fun to go back and watch. I thought. Gary Shaw had a really, there were positives and negatives about Gary Shaw, but I think he understood very much booking a television card. They would typically open with quick heavyweight fight, get your interest, have some big personalities mixed throughout the show. And, he wasn't there to do 7-hour shows. It was, boom, 5 fights on the main card. You're in and out. You're left wanting more. understood the value of protecting someone like Kimbo Slice, putting him against the right opponents. And, unfortunately, it was just financial excess for that company, and it led to their demise. But Elite XC was, they got to CBS.
Yeah,
There's some different decisions along the way.
Sure.
It might have been a different pathway for them. But this week marks their 10-year anniversary. Wow. Quickly, the next show you will be calling TKO 38.
TKO 38. These guys have just really come back with a vengeance. And, I'm not trying to hype it up. Just the product has been incredible. The last two shows that Rob and I had a chance to call, there's something, there's a lot of people out there that have a specific opinion of Stefan Patry. And, I'm using him as an example, but that's fight promoters in general. They have a certain reputation, whether they burn people or they put fighters in certain predicaments. But one thing about this guy is he understands entertainment, and specifically fight entertainment, and he really has a keen eye for the future stars of mixed martial arts. This was George St. Pierre's manager. He had this promotion that showcased George St. Pierre and Mark Hominick and Stout and Patrick Cote and Sean Shirk and Rich Franklin and Hatsuki Oki. So he understood not only just the local scene, but global mixed martial arts. And if you are in Montreal, or even if you don't live in Montreal, if you're willing to make the drive, the show is just sensational. La Tohu in Montreal is just a beautiful venue. It's like a bowl designed for mixed martial arts. And just the young fighters and some of the established names, Derek Gauthier and UFC veteran Jesse Ronson on the next card. And again, just littered with serious talent, and just it will be a night of entertainment that people they won't forget, because they sign real fighters that come to scrap.
It's going down Friday, April the 7th.
Yeah, what a busy week we have. You're at WrestleMania. We have the TKO show, and then we have a bunch of
shows.
Yeah,
it's a small little show happening in Buffalo the next day.
UFC
We're going to die.
Yeah.
Yes, but that's a lot of stuff to look forward to. Thanks as always, John. It's great to chat with you. You can catch all of his work. FightNetwork.com. Go to YouTube.com/Fight Network. He hosts 5 rounds. 5 rounds today, anything with the rounds in it, and he might be going for some rounds tonight. We will chat with Jon Anik coming up and lots more as we continue on the MMA Report. Thank you very much to John Ramdeen for joining me, and now we are going to hear from Jon Anik. He is going to be calling the UFC 208 pay-per-view event this Saturday night. He has been doing a Iron Man run of shows. If you recall, he did the Phoenix show last month with Yair Rodriguez and BJ Penn, then the Fox card with Juliana Pena and Valentina Shevchenko. Then he was in Houston last weekend, and this weekend he's in Brooklyn calling UFC 208. So here he is, Jon Anik, joining us on the MMA Report.
Oh, another big knee for Andrade. Thought about the flying knee there. Hill too quick. Andrade continues to throw haymakers. What a fight for the fans here in Houston. Jessica Andrade and Angela Hill go the distance in an absolute classic.
All right, we are back here on the MMA Report. It's John Pollock with you. It is never a quiet week in the UFC, and our guest knows that all too well. He is one of the many voices of the UFC. We'll be calling UFC 208 this Saturday night, 10 p.m. Eastern Time on pay-per-view. Also the co-host of the Anik and Florian podcast, and the professor of pronunciation, Jon Anik, joins us. John, how are you?
I'm doing well, John. Good to hear you, man. Thanks for having me.
Now, I could not possibly start off this interview without going back to Sunday night and imagining that fourth quarter for one Jon Anik and watching this improbable comeback from the New England Patriots. Can you take us into the mind of one Jon Anik watching this Super Bowl this past Sunday night?
Dude, I thought they were done. 28-3, even 28-9. I just thought it was a huge ask for them to get back into that football game. And I've certainly witnessed greatness from Brady and Belichick and so many unsung heroes underneath them over the last couple decades or so, but it just seemed improbable. And I feel like if Bill Belichick had a 28-3 lead in a Super Bowl situation or otherwise, he holds that lead, or his team holds that lead 100 out of 100 times. So I feel for the Falcons fans, because I've been there obviously before as well as a sports fan. But, man, I don't know that I've had any more just heart-wrenching, exhilarating night as a sports fan than I had last night, man. Just happy for the team, the players, my 65-year-old mother who lives and dies with this team. So it was very exciting. But I'd be lying if I told you that I didn't think the game was over, man. I thought they were cooked.
Given all of the different factors, John, following the Patriots, was this the greatest football game you have seen? Is it in that conversation with a few others? I mean, where does this rank in the immediate aftermath in terms of just being a fan of the Patriots? I mean, I feel this is going to be one of those Super Bowls that is talked about for years to come.
Yeah, I think so, too. I mean, I don't have the greatest historical framework sort of predating the 1990s, but yeah, certainly I think this is going to go down as not just the greatest comeback in Super Bowl history, but probably the greatest game of all time. I think a lot of Falcons fans would think maybe it doesn't qualify there. But, for me, obviously, when the Patriots won that first Super Bowl in 2001, I was a season ticket holder back in the day when the Pats were the laughing stock of the NFL. They were the bottom feeders of the AFC East and did not do very well, so we feel like we put in the time. And when they won that first one in 01, I don't know that I'll ever have a sports moment top that, but damn if last night didn't come wicked close.
And what is the bet that you had with one Brian Stan? What did this entail for Mr. Stan here in this Patriots comeback?
Well, it's interesting because, my heart's invested with the Boston team, so I never bet on them. But he was brought in by the Atlanta Falcons coaching staff last year to speak to the team and work with some of their players on just being a little bit more violent with a lot of their football movements. So he, as someone who lives in the state, has adopted that team, and obviously me as a Patriots fan, he wanted to put something on the line. This was all his doing. I like the Falcons in the game, John. I like the Falcons +3. I'd like them to win the game. But to do this for him, I did it. And we had to get the loser of the game, Pats or Falcons, had to get their legs waxed from ankle to groin, front and back. So I hope Brian Stan is ready to go, because he's getting it done at least probably within the next 3 weeks.
Well, we all know Brian Stan is a man of integrity, and his word is gold, and the man will have to follow through on this bet. That's fantastic. We're not going to spend this entire discussion on football because I did want to touch on the eve of the Super Bowl in Houston, and you had the pleasure of being cage side for Jessica Andrade and Angela Hill, and I just wanted to get a sense of being there cage side, John, if you're able to fully take in, because watching at home, this felt like truly one of the great female fights we've ever seen, and somewhat appropriate that this week is the 10-year anniversary of Gina Carano and Julie Kedzie for Elite XC, and this, to me, is an early front-runner for Fight of the Year, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think so, too. It's funny you harken back to the Gina Carano-Julie Kedzie fight in Tunica, Mississippi, because that was the first live event in mixed martial arts that I had ever attended, and my addiction essentially for this sport started that night. But this fight was absurd, and when we're calling it, maybe at times we might even oversell it, but at my core, I'm a fan, and it's just unbelievable to see people compete athletically like that. It's just a toughness physically and mentally that I can't relate to and never could relate to as an athlete. And I think for Jessica Andrade, it's valuable experience gained, obviously, to have gone 15 minutes now in the weight class. And what else can you say about Angela Hill, the improvements that she made, and just to come in here as a huge underdog and put forth that type of toughness and even have some real shining moments in the fight. You need that ebb and flow. You need that back and forth type of situation to produce a fight of the night. And on a night that had so many shining stars and seminal moments, obviously those two women kicking off the main card stood out.
Yeah, it was a real sign of things to me, John, when you heard the bonuses come out, and it was just a credit to the different performances you saw when James Vick, Khalil Roundtree, and Marcel Fortuna, these are guys that were not even in the bonus dollars, and it was just the performances you saw on Saturday night. They were varied all across the board and turned out to be a really entertaining card. From the first fight of the night with Khalil Roundtree right up until Chan Sung Jung, which I felt Brian Stan summed up perfectly. This is not supposed to happen, where you see a guy out for so long and comes back and boom, the Korean Zombie is right in that featherweight mix with likely a top 5 opponent next.
Yeah, it was an unbelievable show, but certainly Chan Sung Jung stole it there at the end with that performance against Dennis Bermudez, who really was coming on and had won 9 of his last 11, 2 straight. You remember Bermudez obviously had that long winning streak and then had dropped a couple, and he looked like he was really riding the ship and working his way towards a title fight. And, man, for the Zombie to come back after 3.5 years on the shelf, the big question for me was if he got crapped early, and he did, how would he respond to it? Because even though he was in great shape and seemingly training harder and better than before, you just don't know how much sparring he did and just how hard he got hit over the last 3.5 years. So remarkable accomplishment for him, obviously. And in terms of his ceiling at 145 pounds, I always thought it was high. And again, he's a former world title challenger, but now I think I would take it a step further. I think he can be champion. I think in a few more fights, it's not out of the realm of possibility that he could find himself in there with Max Holloway or Jose Aldo, maybe Swanson or Yair Rodriguez. There are a huge number of fantastic options for him at 45, but just an unbelievable result to see a guy come back from that far removed from the sport and produce a moment like that. He's a star.
So, John, you find yourself in a very interesting position right now because you're doing more than ever. Houston is now in the rearview window. Now you've got Brooklyn Saturday. Halifax is coming up the week after. How far ahead are you looking at cards? Is it simply one card at a time, that it's tunnel vision, or are you looking at 2-3 ahead in terms of just your own preparation with so many cards on the menu for you?
Yeah, it's tricky, and I know promotionally they don't necessarily think it's ideal for me to be doing 4 weekends in a row because something falls through the cracks. I mean, you hope it doesn't, right? But when you're talking about preparing, 96, 98 fighters in a month, you just can't give them the attention that necessarily they deserve when you're doing 2 or 3 shows a month. So I'm not doing Halifax, thankfully. I can tell you Todd Grisham's going to call that show, even though I love Nova Scotia. I'm not going to be able to get back there, unfortunately. So because this will be 3 straight, obviously, doing UFC 208 this weekend, but you always have to be a little bit ahead of it. Nothing is more frustrating during fight week when I get a voiceover request for another show, but that's just the nature of the beast. And so a lot of the UFC 208 voiceover work gets done during the UFC Houston fight week. A lot of the Houston work gets done during the Denver week, and that's just sort of the way it goes. But, ultimately we get to town pretty early. We do have a couple days, away from our children and our families where we can really do the tunnel vision thing and prep. But I always tell people that if this fight card somehow, got delayed 5 hours, right, blackout in the arena, we could always make good use of that time. You never feel like you have enough time.
As you're looking ahead to this Saturday night, this is the first pay-per-view post Mike Goldberg. It's going to be a 3-man booth. Are you looking at this card as any different than, you've done pay-per-views in the past, but this is you in the big chair on a main pay-per-view. Is this any different than any other cards for you?
Well, I do have to sort of treat it show by show. Even in terms of this promotion, if you want to call it that, you're really only as good as your last show. So to me, the focus was really on Houston. I hadn't even thought about the pay-per-view, obviously, until now here Monday during fight week. But, yeah, it does have a different feel. I'm excited to do pay-per-view because there's no commercial inventory. A lot of these shows that here in the States are on FS1. The commercial inventory is heavy, and so a lot of these walks are not televised, and a lot of the time when we're telling these stories and really humanizing these men and women, half of our audience is in commercial breaks. So I'm excited for the possibility to have those walks to tell stories, obviously to work with the legend Joe Rogan. I've had a chance to work with him 3 times before, but not since 2013. So on a personal level, that's very exciting for me. Daniel Cormier is one of my best friends, so to have him with us is just the added bonus. I think it'll take some time to sort of work out the navigation with the 3-man booth. I've never done 3 in mixed martial arts. How quickly the sport moves. So, you might see me laying back in the cut a little bit and trying to pick my spots maybe more than normal as we just get through the navigation early. But very excited to work a pay-per-view. It's certainly, something I've had my hopes on and my eyes on for a while and thankful, for the added spotlight and the opportunity.
Yeah, I think that it's something that's been echoed, certainly, but the ability for so many present-day fighters and elite-level ones, case in point being Daniel Cormier, that have been able to make these transitions, not just as analysts at the desk, but also color commentary, which are very different roles. And the ability to, from Daniel Cormier's first broadcast to his most recent, you see those gains right away. And this is something that's very unique to mixed martial arts, John, in the fact that these are fighters right in the prime of their careers, that here's Daniel Cormier, who's going to be fighting April the 8th, and he's calling a pay-per-view 2 months prior.
Yeah, and I really feel like my producers back in the day at ESPN deserve a lot of credit for that reality because it was their vision to put live active fighters and champions on the set, and it wasn't something, you're right, John, that was being done consistently. But I hope this doesn't just sound like a promotional shill or a line, but I'm amazed at just how many high-quality analysts we have in the sport. I mean, the added bonus, obviously, is that they're all active fighters and elite fighters at that, but it's just remarkable that they're able to continue competing and training on a regular basis and still give this type of attention to the broadcast. I think they all have their different strengths, obviously. Some are very technical, some are research crazed, some are just fight film fanatics, and other guys, Cormier obviously has a lot of strengths across the board, but he's comedic. I mean, he brings a levity to the broadcast that has really injected a lot of fun into it for me. So, yeah, I'll have worked with, 6 guys over the last 13 months, and it's very exciting to have the chance to do so, and they're all very talented people, man, and make each other shine. It's been fun.
As you go into this Saturday's pay-per-view broadcast, John, there's a lot of us who, we're in a bubble. We're consuming this day to day. You're aware of all the news that's happening. But especially for pay-per-views, you do have that audience that is maybe not consuming this daily. So when they tune in, is there part of you that is expecting the questions to come on Twitter, social media Saturday night, hey, what happened to Mike Goldberg? Because there's some that are not going to be aware of this until they tune in Saturday night, that are not hardcore fans that are watching cards every week or updated on that news.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's just something that you deal with. Part of the reason why social media is in my life and is valuable is because there is criticism that I get from fans that is constructive and useful and actually stuff that I employ going forward. So it's certainly more good than bad when it comes to what's out there. But, yeah, I know that I am filling big shoes this weekend, and nobody has more respect for what Mike Goldberg has accomplished. I was a senior in high school when he made his UFC play-by-play debut. So he obviously is the voice of the UFC and has been for the better part of a couple decades, and my hat goes off to him. And, I am excited that they're entrusting me with this opportunity, and I just have to sort of approach it and focus on the show in that regard and try to tune out some of the noise, which inevitably is going to be there. I mean, I remember when I got hired in 2011, Dana told me first day in his office, tune out the noise. Your haters are going to triple, and you just have to tune that stuff out and keep being you. And even that day, I'll never forget, October 29, 2011, he said, we didn't hire you to be Mike or Joe, so keep being yourself, and I just need to stay true to that this weekend and beyond.
Well, during a broadcast, are you monitoring what people are saying about the broadcast? Do you save that for after the show? Because it seems broadcasters have very different philosophies when it comes to engagement on things like Twitter in real time, and whether they are following that or just tuning that out when they're in the middle of a broadcast.
Yeah, I'm not on social media when I'm calling UFC fights, but I'll tell you honestly, John, most of the shows I've done have been international and in a lot of places where I don't even have Wi-Fi during the show. So I'm really just focused on what we're doing. I know some of my broadcast partners are monitoring Twitter. And again, I go back and forth on it, right, because it's not without its value, even during a broadcast. It is something that could help us. So you never want to turn back something that could be helpful for you potentially. But, yeah, it's not something that I do regularly.
Before we wrap this up, John, I mean, you have made a great point on the broadcast since January 1st to update people on the new rules that have been implemented. And we're looking at the fact that not all shows are the same dependent on what state we are in. Just as simply an observer here, what have your thoughts been on just the implementation by some commissions while others, such as Texas this past weekend, who have not yet to vote on the new rules, how that has made it a source of confusion for some fans, that you're kind of in the position to try and keep people updated on what the new rules are, or rather not, for a given show?
Yeah, it's tricky. We made the decision from a broadcast standpoint that we were going to alert people to the fact that some commissions were adopting these rules and others weren't. But, of course, since the rule changes were passed, not universally, 2 of the 3 shows we've done, the commissions haven't adopted the rules in Colorado and most recently in Texas this weekend. Now we go to UFC 208 in New York, and the rules are in place. So it's a little bit tricky, and, we try not to second-guess ourselves, but even when you see a guy put a point of contact down on the canvas now, I'm thinking, wait a second, new rules in play or not, in real time. So it has been confusing. We're trying to get ahead of it as much as we can, and I really think until you have those learning moments where we bring in Mark Ratner and a foul is committed that maybe was or wasn't a foul previously, those are really the teaching opportunities, and I think we'll all eventually get more conditioned to it. But it's disappointing. I mean, certainly promotionally for us, and certainly I know for John McCarthy and other people that are intimately involved, that this is not universally accepted, and there's still some holdouts, unfortunately.
Did you have any strong feelings, pro or con, about any of the new rules that were passed last summer?
I'm pretty much behind all of them. You know, the only thing that sort of struck me kind of funny is that you're now able to grab the clavicle. Like, do we really need to do that? And you notice how, like, that wasn't something that we flaunted because it's something that I've never seen in mixed martial arts. No one grabs the collarbone. I don't know why necessarily you would want to be allowed to, but a rule like that might get a casual fan to be like, really? They need to let them grab the collarbone is something that I think you can not only do without, but not something that we're going to go out of our way to draw attention to on the broadcast. But everything else I think is really good, and I think the most interesting one for me is not necessarily the grounded opponent, but in terms of the direction of the fingers. You know, that became a big problem with the eye pokes, and I really think you're going to see fighters be very dutiful in changing the way they work with their hands because, you know, an intolerant referee is going to take a point pretty quickly there.
Yeah, it was funny because, you know, going over that rule, I recently just watched The Hurt Business on Netflix, and John Jones acknowledges this and pretty much just says, Daniel Cormier, this was prior to their first fight, where he said, Daniel Cormier should be worried because I do poke people in the eyes and I can get away with this, essentially, and just pretty much shone a light on this glaring hole. And I'm glad that it's been at least addressed now because it was becoming a major issue, I feel, with eye pokes that were just unnecessary and potentially very dangerous to a fighter's career.
Yeah, and it's tricky, too, in MMA, right? Like, even fence grabbing, and I'm getting off topic a little bit, but there are hugely varying degrees of enforcement when it comes to referees. So if you're a fighter and you can get away with a fence grab with a warning or even a soft warning, and it can prevent you from being taken down, you can change the whole complexion of the fight. So until we become more intolerant when it comes to referee and more willing to take points away, I don't think you're going to affect wholesale change. And the fence grabbing drives me absolutely crazy. But we're moving in the right direction. I mean, these are hard to change. I mean, McCarthy would be the first to tell you it's hard to get changes. So the fact that we're even making changes here in 2017 is a very good thing.
Yeah, it's also going to be interesting to see kind of the adaptation when it comes to 10-8 rounds. There's a lot clearer language now, but you also have judges that have come up a whole generation of kind of what a 10-8 round is in their mind, and it seems almost no 10-8 is the same if you were asked different judges, and that may take a whole cycle of different judges to kind of look at rounds and whether it's a 10-8 or not. I mean, we saw Curtis Blades on Saturday night, John, where, I mean, how that first round was not a 10-8, I mean, that to me under the new rules is almost 10-7 territory.
I agree. You can make an argument that that's a 10-7, absolutely. A 10-9, and again, I oftentimes will do interviews like this with the rules in front of me so I can have the exact language because it always seems to come up. But a 10-9, as you well know, John, is supposed to be reserved for a close round. And I can't tell you how many times I've watched an MMA round, I've scored it 10-9, and it has not been close at all. Some party has dominated, but it wouldn't even cross my mind to be that liberal with a 10-8. And got to be more liberal with 10-8s. I wouldn't mind seeing some 10-10s for close rounds, but if we can reserve the 10-9s for close rounds where both guys or both women have their moments, I think that'll result in more 10-8s. If you focus on 10-9s as close rounds, you'll be more liberal with your 10-8s.
Last thing, just ending it off on UFC 208 as an observer going into Saturday night. I mean, what are one or more of the key stories you see on Saturday night? Because we have the introduction of the Women's Featherweight Championship, and I feel a big one is Anderson Silva fighting at 185 pounds, and what version of Anderson Silva we're going to see on Saturday. Not to mention the Barclays Center, a major arena, and I think that's going to be a very intimate environment for the UFC. I mean, a major league venue, but a new one nonetheless that has had excellent crowds in the past for various sports.
It's a beautiful arena, and I think going forward, and this is just pure speculation, you might actually see more of these New York pay-per-views, the downtown ones in city, end up at Barclays Center as opposed to Madison Square Garden. Logistically, this is just a modern-day building that is custom-made for great live events like this. So that's exciting. Obviously, the Brooklyn component. Obviously, the fact that Holly Holm has a chance to join Randy Couture, BJ Penn, and Conor McGregor as a two-division champion is remarkable. I mean, say what you want about the fact that she's coming off 2 losses, but those are the only 2 losses in her career. I think she's worthy of this opportunity. She's a slight underdog against Jermaine Durandamy, which I think is interesting. I think that might move a little bit. But the Silva-Brunson fight, yeah, I mean, where is Anderson at this stage of his career? Hasn't won in an awfully long time, but this is a stylistic matchup that I think is one that he can take advantage of. Certainly this is one that in his prime I think he would fare pretty well in. So interesting to see the Spider as an underdog. And I really have my eyes on Glover Teixeira against Jared Cannonier because a lot of people are talking about the Killer Gorilla, obviously relatively new to this division. Quick turnaround after the war against Iwan Kutelaba in December. A lot of people think maybe he's biting off more than he can chew, but at least according to the betting line, which I got my eyes on, Glover's a slight favorite here. So I think that's a closer fight than people think, and always just excited to see on a night when a guy like Cannonier can change his life forever if he actually can go out and do it.
Have you ever thought, John, about, as a companion to the Anik and Florian podcast on Fight Week, putting out an audio file of all the pronunciations? Do you know the kind of resource you could be for so many people out there?
So Joe Silva and I tried for a long time, and it's still a goal, even though Joe has moved on, to get every single fighter audio file on UFC.com on the fighter page. I don't know logistically why we haven't accomplished that yet, but believe you me, John, and you know this well, that it would be so nice to be able to direct people on fight night to that file, so when they hear us say Michinori Tanaka, they can go listen to him say it that way. And especially when it comes to Japanese names, you see a lot of these networks, especially in the United States, they Americanize them. So instead of calling Daisuke Matsuzaka Daisuke, they call him Daisuke, and that's not something we at the UFC do. We're an international sport. We pronounce these guys' names the way they say it, and it's obviously something that I'm fairly passionate about because I take it seriously, and these guys deserve as much. But you're right, John. We need a better system to get it out to the masses for sure.
Well, you are the authority I always go by, Mr. Anik, and you do a tremendous job each and every broadcast with the correct pronunciations, which is something I always try to pride myself on as well. So I want to thank you so much. Once again, UFC 208, it's going down this Saturday night. Fight Pass kicks off at 7 Eastern, pay-per-view at 10, and do check out the Anik and Florian podcast on SoundCloud, iTunes, and you can send your comments and feedback to John_Anik on Twitter. Always a pleasure to catch up with you, John, and the best going into Saturday night in Brooklyn. We will be watching.
Thank you, bud. Love to have you on the show sometime. Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you to Jon Anik for joining us. Catch UFC 208 Saturday night, and that is where we are going to finish off the show, taking a look at the card on Saturday night. When you look up and down, this is certainly a card that I feel is going to be an entertaining one. There's some interesting fights. As we look at Fight Pass, not a bad Fight Pass lineup. Felipe Nover is going to be fighting Rick Glenn at 145 pounds. I like Rick Glenn in this fight. I don't feel that Nover is going to be able to present too many problems to Rick Glenn. I think this fight stays on the feet, which is going to favor Glenn. Probably a decision. We will see. Rick Glenn made his UFC debut, short notice fight that he took against Evan Dunham, and went the distance with Dunham, which I think is a mark in his favor rather than against for the featherweight in Rick Glenn. Johan Carneiro takes on Ryan LaFleur. It's been a while since we've seen Ryan LaFleur. December of 2015. Only one blemish inside the UFC. That was going 25 minutes with Damian Maia. Much like Rick Glenn losing to Dunham by decision, I don't think you hold too much against LaFleur for that loss to Damian Maia. I just see LaFleur as the better athlete here than Carneiro. Certainly Carneiro, submission threat whenever he is off his back or even on top, but I feel that Ryan LaFleur is going to be able to outwork him. I don't know if he finishes him. He has the capabilities to. However, Ryan LaFleur, I feel pretty confident in that fight. Justin Willis is taking a ultra short notice fight against Marcin Tybura at heavyweight. That will round out the Fight Pass portion. I like Tybura in this fight. He is coming off of a big knockout victory over Victor Pesta last August, and then was supposed to fight Derek Lewis in October on that Manila card that ended up getting scrapped. So he goes to Fight Pass. I guess he was going to be on Fight Pass against Derek Lewis and stays on the platform. On to the televised prelims, which will air at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on FS1 in the U.S., TSN 5 if you are in Canada. Ian McCall will take on Jared Brooks. Brooks is taking the spot of Neil Seery, who had a death in the family and had to remove himself from this card. Jared Brooks is definitely not a prospect to sleep on. We are going to have a lot of questions answered about Ian McCall, who, if this guy did not have bad luck, he would have no luck at all. He has had so many fights fall apart since the last time we saw him, which was 2 years ago against John Lineker. We've followed him with his hand problems, and just fights falling apart at the last minute over the last year. It's been awful luck for one Ian McCall. And you have to wonder what those 2 years have done to Ian McCall. Is he going to be slower? Is he going to have that same kind of edge? Jared Brooks, he was an alternate for the most recent season of The Ultimate Fighter, the flyweight season. This guy's a tremendous personality. I definitely encourage you to just YouTube Jared Brooks. He did a great interview with James Lynch that you could check out. A great personality, and I really see him entering the flyweight division, and I'm going to pick him here for the upset. This is someone that has great takedown ability, lots of power on top, and if he can have that success against Ian McCall, he can make a big statement here in his first UFC fight. Islam Makhachev and Nick Lentz is one of those fights where I could either see Makhachev coming out or even Nick Lentz and they just land something and ends this fight out of nowhere, or we could be in for a tough 15-minute grinding affair. I favor Makhachev. I think that Nick Lentz, somewhat reserved from past performances. He's coming off wins over Danny Castillo and Michael McBride. McBride was a tougher fight than I thought it would be for Nick Lentz. Granted, it was a short-notice fight, and Michael McBride, a good opponent, but I feel that Makhachev, it just seems that he is, I mean, when you're getting a decision victory off of Chris Wade, I think he knows what kind of a fight to expect from Nick Lentz, and I will pick Makhachev in this fight. Wilson Hayes and Ulka Sasaki. Wilson Hayes should dominate this fight. I see no reason to believe that Ulka Sasaki is going to present much of a threat to Wilson Hayes, who has unfortunately lost out on his flyweight title shot last July when Demetrius Johnson got hurt. I feel it will be a matter of time before Hayes can take him down, likely submits him in the first or second. And then Bilal Muhammad and Randy Brown, there's an enormous size difference here. Brown has a 7-inch reach advantage, and I just feel he's going to find an opening and just drop shots on Bilal Muhammad. And much like Vicente Luque found that opening, I feel Randy Brown will too. If he doesn't stop him, I feel he will win the decision, but a stoppage is likely in this fight. So I will pick Randy Brown. On to the main card, Dustin Poirier takes on Jim Miller at lightweight. Dustin Poirier has looked great since he returned to 155 pounds. That was a solid career choice for Poirier, who was killing himself getting down to 145 pounds. Jim Miller, we watched him against Michael Chiesa and then the fight against Diego Sanchez, and then realized that this guy was dealing with Lyme disease and has it under control and turned things around with wins over Takanori Gomi, a very close decision against Joe Lozon, and then defeating Thiago Alves. I think the fact that he fought 4 times in 2016 is pretty indicative of Jim Miller, who is going to be having his 25th UFC fight on Saturday. Unfortunately, it's with someone against Dustin Poirier, who I feel has gotten, he is much more strategic in his offense. He's not just going out there and just throwing bombs and hoping for the best. He is much more cerebral, I think is maybe the best word to use here. I feel that Dustin Poirier is going to be able to land on Jim Miller. I think that's going to pile up on him. Maybe he goes for a takedown later in the fight, just to kind of secure. We saw against Joseph Duffy, not afraid to use his wrestling, though maybe doesn't want to be putting Jim Miller on his back where that can be somewhat advantageous for Miller. But I think later in the fight, once he's piled up those points, I think he might just try and secure the fight with that. But I like Dustin Poirier a lot in this fight. Glover Teixeira and Jared Cannonier, talked about this a little earlier. I just think with Jared Cannonier, I don't know what to make of him. We've seen him have one fight in the UFC at 205 pounds, and it was against Iwan Kutalaba. It was a great fight, but Glover Teixeira, even after the 13-second loss to Anthony Johnson in his last fight, that does present some questions. But to me, way too many tools for Glover Teixeira to exploit Cannonier here, whether it is clinching up against the fence, mixing in short uppercuts against the fence, and then ultimately taking Cannonier to the mat where it is Teixeira all night long. I don't see Teixeira losing this fight. And this is maybe one of those fights where a year or two from now we look back and wonder why they put Cannonier in this fight. Certainly, he may surprise a lot of people, where Iwan Kutalaba was just the tip of the iceberg for his potential at 205 pounds. God knows this division needs someone like a Jared Cannonier to break out, but I don't see Glover Teixeira being the person to showcase that against. So I have Glover Teixeira picked in that fight. Ronaldo Jacare Souza and Tim Boetsch, you always are aware of that power Tim Boetsch has and winning fights late where he can turn things around. But with Jacare, his hands have improved so significantly since his Strikeforce days to complement his world-class ground game, which is where I feel this fight ends up. And a good comparison would be how Luke Rockhold was able to dominate Tim Boetsch once he got the fight to the ground. I see a similar outcome here with Jacare. Possibly submitting Tim Boetsch, I think that's very possible. And Jacare is in an unfortunate position because here he was. Many people thought he beat Yoel Romero at UFC 194, lost that decision. 2016 was kind of just a wash for him. It was a lot of just waiting around, not having the kind of fights that were going to get him anywhere close to the title. It was just keep busy. Had to go to 205 in November, made weight as an alternate to just be on standby notice if a middleweight fell through. And now he gets Tim Boetsch, where even if you win in impressive fashion, it's Yoel Romero who's got that ticket for the next title fight, and he's waiting. So there's very likely odds that Jacare is going to have to fight again after this before we're talking about a title opportunity for someone that you can make the argument is the top middleweight in this division. Anderson Silva and Derek Brunson, what a difficult fight to forecast. Anderson Silva, I don't put any stock into the Daniel Cormier fight. I don't feel that Silva's head or heart were in that fight. It was to simply save Daniel Cormier on that card when John Jones was taken out on just a few days' notice. He was fighting at 205 pounds, not that far removed from gallbladder surgery. I think you can look at the Michael Bisping fight as more indicative of where Anderson Silva is. Is this 41-year-old Anderson Silva going to have the same speed and reflexes of a 34-year-old Anderson Silva? Probably not. But Derek Brunson, if he comes out like a maniac, as he did against Robert Whittaker, he is going to run into something, and it's going to be reminiscent of Lyoto Machida, Ryan Bader from 2012. I feel Anderson Silva, even with a lesser skill set than maybe prime Anderson Silva possessed, should beat Derek Brunson. Brunson has the ability to take down anyone in this division. He was able to take down Yoel Romero, an Olympic medalist in wrestling. So I don't doubt that he could take down Anderson Silva, but Anderson Silva, I feel, will be able to telegraph any takedowns, counter off of any attempts from Brunson. And Brunson's success at middleweight, it has not been through wrestling and grinding guys out. It's been with his power. And if he goes shot for shot with Anderson Silva, I feel he's going to eat the wrong end of an Anderson Silva strike, and this one gets finished. So with reluctance, I pick Anderson Silva, but Derek Brunson certainly has the ability to win this fight and get right back on track in that middleweight division after his 5-fight win streak was snapped against Whittaker last November. And the main event is Holly Holm and Germaine de Randamie. Many variables to this fight. Holly Holm needs a win very badly. If she loses this fight, there's going to be a real autopsy to be had on Holly Holm and what has happened since the Ronda Rousey victory. I think everyone can chalk up the Miesha Tate loss to someone that just got caught late in the round, in the 5th round, in a fight she was winning when that 5th round began. But then the Valentina Shevchenko fight was more problematic in that it was a fight she clearly lost after winning the 1st round, and then the remaining 4, she was hesitant at times to initiate, and then when she did move forward, it was the patience of Shevchenko that just countered and read Holly Holm like a book, and it was a blueprint to beat Holly Holm. Germaine de Randamie, it's very difficult. Her best wins have been against lesser competition. In her last fights against Larissa Pacheco and Ana Elmos, these are fighters that are not anywhere at the level of Holly Holm. And the question is, can Germaine de Randamie take that ability that she was able to showcase against women of that level and perform against Holly Holm? Germaine de Randamie, watch those fights. She can land some incredibly clean shots. She can see openings. Now, can Holly Holm telegraph better and counter? Probably. But Germaine de Randamie, if she can keep up that pace, she is going to land on Holly Holm. And Germaine de Randamie has finishing power. I don't think Holly Holm has the same ability to stop her with power. And if Holly Holm is going to win this fight, probably a decision unless she can land that left kick again, and you know that Germaine de Randamie is going to be ready for that. So this becomes an interesting fight. This is a big step forward for Germaine de Randamie, but for Holly Holm, there's a lot riding on this fight, and I'm always hesitant when someone's in kind of a must-win scenario in their own head, and that's what Holly Holm, from her own words this week, sounds as though she is in. So I am picking Germaine de Randamie in this fight. I just feel she is going to find opportunities that Holly Holm, she can be defensive as she wants to be, but Germaine de Randamie is going to push forward. Now, the fact this is a 25-minute fight, we know Holly Holm can go 25 minutes, but it was a 25 minutes against Valentina Shevchenko that not necessarily a positive. I think Germaine de Randamie can draw more from that. Conditioning could be a factor in this fight the later it goes, with de Randamie being able to have that high output and throwing with power. Can she manage that over the course of a longer fight if it goes that long? But I just feel she is one magic bullet to the liver away from ending Holly Holm's night. So my pick is Germaine de Randamie. It's a fun fight for this featherweight title. The bigger question is, what is this division? Will this title even be defended? Because the current division is occupied by two women who very much could have tickets in their back pocket back to 135 and complete the round trip after this card on Saturday night. That's going to wrap up the show. I want to thank our guests, Jon Anik and John Ramdeen, for joining us. Next week on the show, we are going to be looking ahead to the Bellator card that is going down, headlined by Fedor Emelianenko and Matt Mitrione, a big card for Bellator. As well, the UFC has a Sunday night card next weekend in Halifax, Nova Scotia, that will see Travis Brown taking on Derek Lewis, and Johnny Hendricks moving up to 185 pounds to take on Hector Lombard. So there will be lots to discuss next week. We'll be joined by Bellator heavyweight Ole Thompson, who's fighting on that Bellator card against Czech Congo, and maybe some more guests as well. You can subscribe to the MMA Report with John Pollock on iTunes. Please leave us a favorable review if possible, and you can also check out the show every week, FightNetwork.com, LiveAudioWrestling.com, and at YouTube.com/Fight Network. Many different ways to get the show, and we will speak with you next week.